I'm Ingred Newell. I'm 34, and according to my family, I'm still searching for my direction. Tonight at a dinner, where my sister unveiled her new boyfriend as the evening's grand finale, my mother would interrupt me before I could state my profession. And the entire table would erupt in synchronized laughter. What my mother had no way of knowing was that the well-mannered guest handing her the vegetable dish had actually spent over a year searching for me. Not for my sister, for me. And what took place nearly a year later at my sister's wedding, beneath a ceiling I knew more intimately than anyone living, in front of a nationwide television broadcast team. My family still won't discuss it. I can. I've had plenty of practice being the sole person at that table willing to say what's real. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where buried family truths surface and overlooked women finally speak up. If you've ever been the relative your family wrote off, the one they spoke over, the one they explained away with a shrug, this is your story. Leave a comment below and make sure to subscribe. The dinner was at my parents' place in Harrows Bend, Ohio, and I could tell it was a staged production before I even shrugged off my jacket. The special linen was spread. My sister Brooke had prepared the roasted chicken she'd mastered for the county fair pageant back in 2013. Back when she wore the Miss Congeniality sash. And I was the sister they cropped out of the photo caption. I'd driven straight from my workshop, a 15-minute trip across town, and I'd washed my hands thoroughly, but linseed oil settles into your skin creases like a tattoo that won't fade. My mother placed me at the far end beside the china hutch, outside what she refers to as the conversation zone, and that was nothing unusual. What was unusual was the way they kept watching me. All through the first course, my family kept darting glances my direction the way you eye a glass teetering on a shelf's edge. Not curiosity, anxiety. My mom, Brooke, even my dad, Tom, peering through his bifocals and then looking quickly elsewhere. I checked my shirt for marks. Clean. The new boyfriend was the sole person who regarded me like a human being. Grant. Tall, unfailingly courteous, the sort of attentive listener who angles his entire body toward whoever is speaking. He asked my father about his garden tomatoes and genuinely engaged with the answer. Brooke observed him the way you eye a winning lottery number. My mother observed him the way you size up a tax examiner, and in the lulls, they all observed me. Cautious looks circulated around the table like a platter nobody wanted to be caught holding. I'd been part of this family for 34 years, and I still couldn't decode every signal, but I recognized the frequency they traveled on. Something about this evening felt precarious, and they'd collectively decided in advance that the fragile element was me. Then Grant pivoted, aimed his full attention my way, and posed the most ordinary question imaginable. "So what do you do, Ingrid?" My mother placed her fork down with the finality of a judge's gavel. "Let's not go there." She said it casually, cheerfully, the way you'd offer someone more bread. And that's precisely why it struck like an open palm. This wasn't fury. This was protocol. The table laughed, not the cruel kind, which oddly would have stung less. Practiced laughter. The laughter of people who'd heard this routine before and knew their entrance cue. My aunt snickered behind her napkin. My dad scrutinized his chicken as though it held a coded message. And my sister, luminous, polished, hours away from perfection, leaned toward me wearing the smile she reserves for public appearances and said, "Maybe make something up this time, so you don't come across so sad." More laughter, warmer this time, relieved. The glass had been guided safely back from the ledge. Grant didn't laugh. I registered that even in the moment. His eyes moved from my sister to my mother to me, the way someone maps a room's emergency exits. I stayed seated with my hands folded in my lap and did what I've done at that table since I was 22. I smiled. I counted to 10 the way I count passes when sanding a drawer front. Consistent pressure, no scratches. Any other year that would have closed the chapter. Smile, reach for the serving bowl, drive home to the workshop, converse with the furniture. The furniture has better manners. But that particular afternoon, I'd come down from a scaffold beneath a church ceiling in Toledo, and my hands still carried the scent of 140 years of other people's devotion. And something inside me had reached a new kind of exhaustion. So this time I didn't just smile. I spoke. "I'm a conservator," I said, in the same measured tone I use when telling a client their family heirloom predates what they assumed. I bring back things people had written off. That was it. Honest, steady as a level surface. My mother drew air through her nostrils, the sound of a rebuttal being chambered, and steered toward the honeymoon question she'd been holding in reserve. Because in her household, the way you deal with an uncomfortable truth is you speak over it until it consents to vanish. Brooke picked up the relay seamlessly. Portugal, perhaps Italy. And the dinner resumed its momentum, tension released, and I reached for the green beans, already slipping back into my designated function, which is serving as background furniture. Except Grant hadn't shifted. He was focused on me, his water glass frozen midway between the table and his mouth, abandoned, and an expression was building on his face in deliberate slow motion. He set the glass down with the deliberation of someone handling volatile material. "Excuse me," he said, while the table continued its chatter. "Newell." Louder, the table dimmed. "Ingred Newell. Conservation work on Millbury Street." He said that was my studio. Yes, and Grant did something nobody has ever done at that table on my behalf. He released a single astonished laugh and retrieved his phone. His thumbs moved across the screen. He held it toward me. On the display was a photo of a walnut highboy, 1780s, book-matched veneer, the finish radiating like liquid amber. I recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. I'd spent 5 months of my life within arm's reach of that piece. "You did this," Grant said. "This is our foundation's piece. My mother has been attempting to contact you for 14 months. You could hear the refrigerator running from 2 rooms over. My mother's expression did something I'd never witnessed. It searched for a prepared response and returned empty-handed. Brooke's fork hovered in midair with a bite of her prize-winning chicken still impaled on it. Grant continued, oblivious that he was demolishing the architecture of the room as he spoke. His family operated the Whitfield Foundation. Arts preservation, a name even my mother recognized from the society columns she claims she never reads. They had funded the restoration of Fairmont Hall, the grand limestone estate out on County Road 9. And the selection committee had placed one conservator at the top of their list for the ballroom ceiling. Ingred Newell, the sole documented apprentice of Abe Fletcher, who had restored Fairmont once before, back in 1987. "We sent correspondence to your shop twice," Grant said, baffled, nearly laughing again. "You're a remarkably difficult person to reach." I told him I was behind on my mail, which was accurate, and left unsaid that I assumed anything on letterhead was solicitous junk, which was equally accurate. My mother rebooted mid-scene. "I'll grant her that. Well," she said, patting the table as though soothing a skittish animal, "Ingrid tinkers. She's always had a creative streak." "And Grant, courteous, immovable, earnest to his core," said Mrs. Newell, "the committee doesn't rank tinkerers." No one laughed at that. My sister was studying me with a look I honestly couldn't identify because I had never seen it directed at me in my life. Recalculation. The boyfriend they'd orchestrated this entire dinner to dazzle had spent the evening fighting the urge to stare at the family's resident disappointment. Because where he came from, the disappointment was the luminary. My mother reached for the wine bottle and topped off glasses that were already brimming, pale, all of them, exactly as I told you she would. She cornered me in the kitchen while the others had coffee, using the dessert plates as her excuse. My mother possesses a particular register for crisis management. Low, clinical, the tone of a medical billing department, which is precisely what she administered for 26 years. "You are not accepting that job," she said, scraping icing from a plate with methodical precision. I asked her reasoning, "Because that estate is where your sister is having her wedding. If this advances the way it's advancing, you'll be cluttering up Brooke's venue for months." Ladders, drop cloths, you in work clothes while his relatives parade through in formal attire. She rinsed the plate, placed it in the drying rack, and faced me. And for one peculiar instant, I caught what lived beneath the entire performance. Not disdain. Fear. Fear wearing 30 years of managerial polish. This wedding overshadows your pastime, Ingrid. A single misjudgment and outsiders draw conclusions about a whole family. That's all it requires. 1. And there it stood, the operating code exposed on the kitchen counter. She had never once inquired whether I was skilled, because skill was never the measure. Presentability was the measure. A daughter in work boots was an exposure risk, regardless of what her hands could resurrect from ruin. I dried my hands on her embroidered towel and said I'd consider it, which we both understood was my diplomatic fiction, the one dialect of mine she comprehends fluently. I drove back to the workshop with the windows cracked. Above my workbench, taped where Abe positioned it decades ago, is a yellowed index card in his careful block lettering. Nobody applauds the adhesive. It binds regardless. At 11, my laptop chimed. The Fairmont Preservation Trust's formal consultation invitation. Subject line, ceiling. I read it through 3 times and then slept the way a stone sleeps. Brooke phoned the following morning, partly apologetic, partly interrogative. She wanted to understand why I'd created awkwardness at dinner, which is our family's term for being honest at a structurally critical moment. And somewhere in the thicket of that conversation, the staring finally made sense. They'd coached him. Before I ever appeared, my mother had prepped Grant the way you prepare a visitor for an unpredictable animal. Ingrid is in transition. Ingrid is somewhat adrift. Don't probe too deeply. It's a tender area. That's why the entire table had spent the first course monitoring me like incoming weather. They were waiting to see whether the narrative would survive contact. I was a contained risk at my own family's gathering. It wasn't cruelty, Brooke maintained. Mom simply wanted the evening to flow. Grant's family is, you don't grasp what they're like. Every detail carries weight with those people. I said it sounded draining. Every detail carrying weight. And she laughed before catching herself, forgetting we weren't allies in that way anymore. Then she went still. And in that stillness, she spoke the most honest sentence anyone in my family has ever directed at me. You weren't meant to matter tonight. I heard her hear it. The small catch of breath. I didn't phrase it that way, Ing. I gazed across the workshop at Abe's card above the bench, the adhesive that binds. And I felt the remark settle into position like a precisely cut joint. Tight, permanent, structurally essential. It accounted for 34 years in a fistful of syllables. Nobody ever means it, I said. That's the entire problem. I offered my congratulations once more, genuinely, and ended the call. Then I opened the trust's message and typed the 4 words I'd been orbiting since the night before. I'd be honored. When can we begin? You should understand how I arrived here, because my mother's account has me drifting from a sensible road into wilderness. Here's the actual path. At 18, I completed 1 semester of accounting at the community college. Selected because my mother delivered a monologue about health benefits and maintained a framed vision of a daughter stationed behind a reception desk. That October, our church engaged an elderly craftsman to repair water damage on the altar rail at St. Anne's, and I lingered after choir practice to observe him. His name was Abe Fletcher. He was 71 at the time, hands like gnarled roots, and he handled that damaged walnut with the care paramedics use with patients. I asked if the piece was beyond saving. He said, nothing is beyond saving. Some pieces are merely biding time for someone thorough enough. I withdrew from accounting by Thanksgiving, and my mother didn't address me for a full month, which she labeled composure, and which I eventually learned to identify as atmospheric conditions. 12 years I trained in that same brick storefront on Millbury Street. Veneer work, gilding techniques, hide glue that you warm like broth, the chemistry of aged varnish, the ethics of the craft. First principle, never attempt anything you cannot reverse. Abe passed away 2 winters back, 85, at his bench, which is the only location he would have consented to depart from. He bequeathed me the building, the equipment, and a heating system with a terminal rattle. I reside in the apartment above. I've held more conversations with Chippendale chairs than with my mother. The chairs conduct themselves with greater courtesy. Here's the detail that carries weight, though. The one I couldn't see in myself for years. The sign on the front reads Newell Conservation. No first name, no portrait in the local paper ever. I've declined 3 times. 12 years of craftsmanship, and I had never attached my name to a single piece, never displayed my identity where someone could gesture toward it. I convinced myself that was modesty. Hold on to that observation. It becomes critical later. The Fairmont Preservation Trust convened in the ballroom itself, which was deliberate staging, and it was effective. Dust covers draped over the chandeliers, daylight filtering through arched windows, and presiding over all of it, the ceiling. An 1897 mural, the 4 seasons rotating around a painted heavenscape, dulled gray by a century of lamp residue, watermarks trailing down the eastern corner like an old sorrow. My neck ached within the first minute, and I didn't mind in the slightest. The proposal, ceiling and main staircase, 9 months, $48,000 including materials. Reasonable compensation, clear parameters, the commission of my lifetime. Then the trust director passed across a media supplement, a television program called Made to Last, national broadcast. The respected variety, profiles of craftspeople and endangered trades, partnered with the restoration's financial backers. They would document the progress and the completed venue in operation. Recording equipment, on-camera conversations. My mouth went dry in a manner that $48,000 couldn't remedy. I requested a personal exemption. No filmed interviews, credit in text format only. The director's eyebrow lifted. Most contractors request more coverage, not less. But she accommodated it, and I signed using the fountain pen Abe had left me. If my fingers trembled, nobody mentioned it. On my way out, a woman intercepted me in the parking lot. Mrs. Aldi's, the retired librarian, wearing garden gloves and wasting no time on pleasantries. Ingred Newell, I'm still put out with you, you realize. I asked what I'd done. Last spring, we extended an invitation for you to display at the library, a local craft heritage exhibit. We wanted your altar rail documentation, and you refused us completely. Didn't even compose your own reply. I stood in the gravel with my contract tucked under my arm. I had never received any such invitation. Mrs. Aldi's, I said deliberately. Who informed you I declined? Before I reveal that, she replied, you require one more piece of Abe's story, because he's structurally essential as well. 3rd year of my apprenticeship. Sent. Anne's again, the large oak altar table this occasion, fractured clean across the surface following a heating system flood. I was 20 and eager, and I intended to make the fissure vanish. I'd mapped out the entire concealed repair, fillers and color matching, an illusion. Abe observed me arrange my approach, then placed his weathered hand flat across the split. What occurred with this table? I said a flood, so that's factual then. The fracture, I said clearly. Then why are you preparing to make it dishonest? He demonstrated the alternative. A butterfly key, walnut against the oak, installed visibly where anyone could observe it. A small bow tie of fresh timber bridging the damage, rendering the plank stronger than its original state. Congregants still touch it following services. The fracture has remained stable for 13 years. What he said while we clamped it constitutes the nearest thing I possess to a creed. We don't conceal the fractures. We reinforce them until they can bear weight. I have applied that principle to 1,100 objects. Chairs, cradles, a carousel horse, one complete church ceiling. What I had never once applied it to, and I can recognize this clearly from where I stand now, is myself. My entire existence within that family was a concealed repair. Smooth your edges, match the existing finish, disappear into the ensemble. Don't become the fracture in mother's surface. For 12 years, I restored dignity to other people's damaged possessions. And the entire duration, my own identity was a split I kept patching over. Mrs. Aldi's was about to place the chisel in my hand that would crack it open. She regarded me quizzically in that parking lot and said, "Why, your mother, dear? She responds on your behalf. I'll return to Mrs. Aldi's because I made myself confirm the facts before permitting them to solidify. First, the Sunday dinner where my mother launched her counteroffensive like a performance review. She waited until the pot roast was served and then declared to the table, not directly to me, that's the method, that the $20,000 my grandparents had earmarked years prior for Ingrid's building would be redirected toward wedding expenses instead. The wedding takes priority. The heating system can wait. The heating system, for the record, was 14 years beyond its operational lifespan and produced sounds like a man about to deliver unfortunate news. Hide glue requires a heated workspace. Gilding size requires a heated workspace. A sudden temperature drop at the wrong moment can ruin a French polish I'd invested 60 hours constructing. She understood none of the specifics and understood all of the implications. She didn't require the mechanical schematic to know exactly where to apply pressure. And then the second volley, delivered with a smile alongside the gravy. Hensley's accounting firm is recruiting, incidentally, a proper office position. Something I can mention openly at church when people inquire about you. There it resurfaced. Her single commandment, be presentable. I did not argue at the table. You don't prevail at her table. The table belongs to her. I performed the calculations on the drive home instead. $48,000 minus materials minus 9 months of living expenses. The Fairmont Commission would sustain the workshop, but not also cover a replacement heating system. So I took on evening work. French polishing dining collections for a furniture retailer in Toledo. 10 to 1 in the morning, 3 nights weekly. Days beneath a painted sky, evenings burnishing shellac in a warehouse. You want to understand what a woman's value amounts to in my family. Examine what she's permitted to prioritize. Now, Mrs. Aldi's. She forwarded me the email correspondence that week, apologizing for the commotion, and I sat at my bench and read my own obituary composed in my mother's phrasing. The library's invitation, sent to my previous contact address, my parents' residence, dating back to when I was an apprentice without an independent mailing address. And the response from my mother's email account, courteous as a condolence card. My daughter has discontinued working in this field. Please delete her from your records and refrain from further contact. Discontinued working in this field. I verified the date. It corresponded to the same month I'd completed the carousel horse for the county museum. She'd noticed it in the newspaper, uncredited, and asked why I squandered my abilities on other people's discarded objects. Mrs. Aldi's, with her librarian's exhaustive recall, remembered at least 2 additional inquiries across the years. A historical society presentation, a school career presentation. Same address, same answering mechanism. Each one declined in my name, cordially. I want to be measured here because it carries weight. I don't believe my mother sat scheming in the shadows. I believe she genuinely considered herself steering an impractical daughter away from pitfalls. Every doorway she sealed was, in her calculations, one fewer opportunity for me to appear publicly in work clothes and bring her disgrace. That's what rendered it more damaging. Malice you can contest. Arithmetic simply executes. I remained there a long while with the workshop silent around me. All those restored objects bearing witness, and I grasped the architecture of my own existence for the first time. My mother hadn't shielded me from the world. She'd shielded the world from me and labeled it domestic management. I didn't telephone her. There was no version of that conversation in which anyone would recognize a fracture and think to fortify it. Instead, I went to work beneath a sky someone had painted in 1897, and I began ascending. The scaffold went up at Fairmont Hall on a Tuesday in November, a steel framework with a wooden platform positioned within arm's reach of the heavens. The The first day, I followed Abe's protocol with any patient. I lay flat on my back on the platform, one arm's length beneath the mural, and I simply observed. At close range, the 4 seasons resolved into individual brushwork. A swallow's wing executed in 3 strokes. A harvest wagon with its wheel blurred into implied motion. The painter's assurance, still pulsing beneath a century of residue. And one extended water stain trailing down the eastern corner, as though the structure had been weeping about something since before Prohibition. I raised my hand and suspended it inches above the plaster, not making contact. Abe's ritual. You announce yourself first. 9 months, I told it. I've got you. And I need you to absorb what happens next exactly as it unfolded. Plainly, without embellishment. While I was lying there, the venue coordinator crossed the parquet below with her clipboard and called up through the scaffold framework, pleasantly as a chime. Busy season ahead. We're fully booked following your unveiling. First reservations confirmed already. August wedding, Newell Whitfield celebration. Any relation? The scaffold held steady. I held steady. Somewhere above my face, painted January continued snowing over a painted hamlet. My sister, naturally. Brooke demanded the most elegant venue in the county, and the most elegant venue in the county was going to be elegant because of me, and nobody in my family had linked those 2 realities. Because linking them would require placing my name and the word conservator in adjacent proximity. Distant, I called down, which was the most accurate statement I've ever projected through scaffolding. So there it lay, the entire second movement of my narrative spread out like a project brief. Every hour of the coming 9 months, I would be reviving the ceiling above my sister's wedding celebration. Brief intermission, because I need to ask you something. If you ever learned your own family had been silently shutting doors you never even noticed, how did you find out? And what action did you take? Share in the comments. I read each one personally. And if you're visiting for the first time, subscribe, because what my mother did upon seeing my name on that contract, you should hear from me directly. My mother visited the workshop in December. 34 years, and she had never once stepped through that entrance. She stood in the center of my shop. The organized lumber, the wall of clamps, the carousel horse awaiting its museum shipping crate. 12 years of restorations. She registered none of it. She stood the way you stand in a departure lounge, coat buttoned, handbag gripped in both hands, a woman declining to check her luggage into my world. I'll be direct, she said, and was direct. Pull out of the Fairmont agreement. I'll provide $25,000, exceeding the heating system cost, exceeding grandmother's allocation. Treat it as a practical decision. I asked her to explain the practical dimension. She did, and I'll acknowledge this about my mother. When she finally presents her accounting, she doesn't waver. The wedding represented the defining merger of her lifetime, a Newell joining a Whitfield, and every variable required containment. A sister on scaffolding at the venue constituted a variable. A sister in work attire during the in-laws' site visit constituted a variable. One unfavorable impression, Ingrid. Outsiders form judgments about an entire family. I listened through to the conclusion. Then I delivered the truth in the only vocabulary I command completely. This one cannot be reversed, Mom. Fundamental rule of my profession. Never execute what you cannot undo. I've signed. It's structurally committed now. She regarded me for a prolonged moment and something shifted behind her expression. That wasn't ire. That was inventory, possibly a tally producing an unexpected sum. At the entrance, she paused with her hand on the frame. Abe planed that by hand in 1974. Then she said, "Stay off the scaffolding in August," and departed. And the bell above the entrance chimed bright and absurd into the silence. $25,000 to cease existing at my sister's wedding. My father arrived 2 weeks later carrying a tin of thumbprint cookies and something he needed to set down. He moved through the workshop slowly, touched the carousel horse's mane as though it might bolt, and then settled onto the bench beside the stove and told me about the shoes. My mother, 15 years old, St. Anne's parochial school. Her father, my grandfather Earl, whom I never knew, served as the school's custodian. 3 decades of polished corridors. And the mothers at pickup, the ones who drove sedans, developed a routine when Sandra passed by. They'd drag their shoes along the floor. That squeak of a mop just audible enough. Her classmates adopted it. Squeak when Sandra answers in history class. Squeak when Sandra earns the spelling medal. Her shoes had newspaper stuffed in them an entire winter. My dad said, studying his own hands. She showed me once while we were courting and then never again. Made me swear to secrecy. He picked up a cookie he didn't consume. The day you informed her you were leaving accounting for furniture, she wept in the garage where you couldn't witness it. Not because she considers the labor beneath anyone, but because she spent 40 years eliminating the squeak from this family's floors, and you deliberately walked back across the wax. We sat with that. The stove ticked quietly. "It doesn't make it correct," he said finally, which was the most courageous sentence of his marriage. "But you should possess the complete ledger." Then he requested I not reveal he'd shared this, and he returned home to her, the way he always returns home to her, and I sat alone with the cookies and an entirely new dilemma. It is considerably simpler to battle an antagonist than a wound dressed in your mother's clothing. The wedding invitation arrived in March, heavy cream stationery. Fairmont Hall embossed into it, which meant I could feel my own commission beneath my fingertip like Braille, a gorgeous object. And trailing it by 2 days, the telephone call conveying the conditions. My mother's list-making voice. The Whitfields would be hosting family from 3 states. The photographer was scheduled for the walkthrough, and I would attend. She was pleased I'd attend, she stated, and I believe she was, as Brooke's sister who was between positions. "It's cleaner, Ingrid. One evening you'll state you're between positions. Don't create discomfort for us a second time. A second time." I stood in my workshop with the phone pressed to my ear, surveying the wall where 12 years of other people's heirlooms had recovered their provenance. And I want to be transparent about the gravitational pull of it. Every family operates on a currency, and mine pays in a single denomination, causing no trouble. I had accumulated wealth in it my entire life. All that was required was to remain solvent one additional evening. Instead, I regarded the RSVP card with its 2 small checkboxes and its vacant line for names, and I wrote in the quality ink, in my most controlled lettering, Ingred Newell, conservator. Fairmont Hall, attending. No +1, no clarification, just the truth compressed into a single line. I carried it to the mailbox on the corner that very hour, so I couldn't reconsider. And when the lid slammed shut, it resonated exactly like a mortise chisel settling firmly into its cut. There are incisions you can steam away, and incisions you cannot. I stood on the corner in the March wind and understood with composure, with full awareness, that I had just made the latter variety. My mother received the truth via postal service. She did not call. Her silence possessed a physical dimension. The subsequent months I can relay in strokes, the way the mural painter gave the swallow its wing. Winter overnight shifts at the furniture warehouse, burnishing shellac until 1 in the morning, sleeping 5 hours, then on the scaffold by 8. Spring, the water stain in the eastern corner yielded gradually, inch by inch. Beneath it, a painted harvest girl nobody had observed clearly since before my grandmother's era re-emerged with soil on her feet, and a smirk the painter had absolutely intended. I documented every solvent, every retouch in the bound journal Abe maintained. Some nights I drifted off up there on the platform, flat beneath a sky that was slowly recalling it had once been blue. And every few weeks the benefactors inspected. That is how I encountered Vivian Whitfield, Grant's mother, chair of the foundation, a woman my mother's age who wore composure the way others wear ornaments. First visit, she scaled the scaffold ladder in her tailored suit without waiting for an invitation, lay down on the platform beside me without being asked, and studied the harvest girl for a full minute. "Sturgeon glue," she stated finally. Ice and glass for the delamination, I replied. She nodded the way examiners nod. No superficial commentary about my attire, no translation of me for the contributors. She inquired about consolidants the way others discuss weather and actually absorb the response. On her third visit, she mentioned conversationally, "Sealing conservator, you're the bride's sister." I assembled that from the trust documentation. A pause, one brushstroke in duration. Curious. "Your family informed us you were between positions." I kept my gaze on painted January. "I'm never between positions," I said, "merely between acknowledgements." Vivian Whitfield laughed precisely once, like a door releasing its seal. And from that day forward, there were 2 women in the county who knew exactly what I was valued at. In June, the producer from Made to Last arrived to schedule the final segment. A decent man with a gray ponytail and a documentarian's instinct for the essential. The series wanted the hall functioning as intended, not behind velvet barriers, but the room performing its restored purpose. The first event scheduled following final inspection was the August wedding, and the Trust's media provision covered venue functions. He was already discussing aerial crane shots. I reminded him of my exemption, no personal interviews. He didn't contest it. He did something more unsettling. He was candid. "We'll honor that, Ms. Newell, but recognize what it entails. We document the ceiling regardless. The narrative broadcasts regardless. Your name appears in the trust documentation and the credits. That element is no longer yours to conceal. The sole factor you control is whether the figure in the narrative is text on a dark screen or a woman positioned beneath her own creation." He allowed that to settle, then added gently the observation that pursued me for a full month. "In my experience, when the subject declines to speak, another party invariably does. Narratives don't remain unnarrated. They simply switch narrators." I climbed back onto the scaffold after he departed and lay beneath the completed spring quadrant. And for the first time, the silence up there didn't feel like refuge. It felt like a current seeping through a joint I'd neglected to seal. My entire life, I'd framed invisibility as humility, but invisibility isn't a neutral stance. Not genuinely. It's an emptiness, and emptiness gets populated. My mother had been narrating me for 34 years to librarians and historical societies and prospective in-laws, and I had sustained her version by remaining silent. I could continue avoiding the cameras. I could no longer continue avoiding the name I had finally learned to inscribe. Brooke visited the workshop in July, 7 weeks ahead of the wedding, transporting fabric samples as her passport. She had never seen the shop either. Unlike our mother, she looked. She wandered the lumber racks, touched the carousel horse, picked up a cabinet scraper and set it down as though it might discharge. "Has it always carried this scent?" "Linseed and hide glue," I said. "Since 1974. She circled for a while, samples forgotten, and then she sat on Abe's stool and came slightly undone in the contained manner that pageant contestants are trained for. "The Whitfields were wonderful," she said. "That was the complication. Wonderful in a vocabulary she was still acquiring." They conversed about board positions and Basel and provenance, and she would nod and mentally file terms to research in her car afterward. Mom had structured the wedding down to the second, including, she laughed damply, a family photograph window timed to coincide with the film crew's meal break. She considers every angle. Then she surveyed my workshop, 12 years of meticulous restorations, and said what she'd actually come to articulate. "You're fortunate, Ing. Nobody holds expectations for you." She intended it generously. That's the most difficult part. I returned her fabric samples and said as compassionately as honesty permits, "That isn't fortune, Brooke. That's a prison term." I've simply completed serving it. She departed with damp eyes and impeccable bearing, and at the entrance she paused. And for a moment, I glimpsed the 8-year-old who used to take shelter in my bedroom when our mother's dissatisfaction went hunting for a recipient. "The film crew," she said. Mom secured their dinner interval in writing. "She engineered around you, Ingrid. She always engineers around you. The door closed, the bell chimed. 7 weeks remaining, and both of us finally comprehended the arrangement. We dismantled the scaffold on the first Friday in August, and Fairmont Hall recovered its sky. I wish I could transmit to you what the room performed that evening. Late sunlight through the arched windows, and 129 years of lamp residue erased. And the 4 seasons revolving overhead in the hues, the painter mixed the year my great-grandparents were small children. The trust director stood at the center of the parquet and neglected to complete her sentence. The inspection passed without a single correction. And then 2 representatives from the trust did something I hadn't solicited and couldn't stop. They installed a small bronze plaque beside the ballroom entrance, per foundation protocol. The same protocol that credits architects and deceased painters. Ceiling and staircase restoration, Ingred Newell, Studio, 2026. 4 inches of metal, my name in public at the scale of 2 fingers. I stood before it longer than I'll concede to you. And I thought about a sign lacking a first name and a career spent on final pages, and I experienced the plaque accomplishing something no amount of therapy had achieved. It caused the work to exist in the same dimension as me. That's when I detected footsteps on parquet, my mother with the wedding coordinator conducting their site visit. She spotted me, spotted the plaque, and absorbed it the way you absorb a diagnostic report. For a moment, nothing on her face registered at all. Then she turned to the coordinator wearing her hostess expression and said, gesturing toward the doorway, toward my name, "A potted fern would soften this entrance, wouldn't you say?" Something with height. The coordinator jotted a memo. My mother proceeded into the sunlit hall her daughter had resurrected, trailing a task list, arranging her fern. The evening before the wedding, I had legitimate cause to be in the hall. Final moisture assessment, contractor's prerogative, and I utilized it the way people utilize churches after hours. The maintenance platform rolls along the cornice. I lay on it one final time, a foot beneath my completed sky, and I addressed the ceiling the way I used to address Abe, which is to say, softly, and anticipating better responses than I merit. Tomorrow the room would fill with Whitfields and Newells, and a broadcast team. And somewhere within it, my family's version of me and my own version would occupy the same 100 feet of parquet simultaneously for the first time. We don't conceal the fractures, I said to Painted January. We reinforce them until they can bear weight. So I established my parameters clearly, the way you position a clamp. I would attend as a guest and a sister, and I would be genuinely glad, because Grant is a decent man and Brooke beneath all the pageant veneer is my sister. I would not perform. I would not campaign. I would not position myself before any camera deliberately. But if the truth approached and posed a direct question, I was finished lying to it. That was the entire boundary. It fit on a single index card. It had required 34 years to compose. I descended, secured my equipment, and my phone vibrated in the darkened hall. The producer, anticipating tomorrow. Advance notice. An individual from your family contacted the network this afternoon. Identified herself as the family's official representative, requested to preview our questions. I stood beneath the ceiling with the phone illuminating my hand. Of course she had. Narrators don't step down voluntarily. They require replacement. The producer had declined her politely and definitively. Network protocol, no third-party approvals, and per the transparency provision, he was required to notify the trust's contractor about the communication, meaning me. My mother had contacted a national television network to regulate my coverage, and the sole outcome she'd achieved was guaranteeing I learned about it with sufficient time to reflect. There's a lesson embedded there about control, but she wasn't accepting my calls to receive it. Wedding morning was vivid blue and unforgiving. The variety of August day that photographers petition the heavens for. My phone illuminated at 9. Brooke, just keep it ambiguous tonight. Ing, please, just tonight. Ambiguous. The family's final designation for me, not an outright fabrication. Precisely. A deliberate blur, a fern positioned before a plaque. I typed and erased a response 4 times, then sent the single statement that was simultaneously truthful and compassionate. I'll be precisely your sister. Promise. I put on the sea green dress, the sole garment I possess that has never been within 10 feet of a shellac container, and I examined my reflection in the mirror above Abe's utility sink. Not between positions, not somewhat adrift. A woman carrying 9 months of a ceiling in her frame and her own name freshly engraved in bronze. Attending a wedding where the scenario designated her as set dressing. My mother had a strategy involving a fern and a photograph window synchronized to the crew's meal interval. The network had a strategy involving a crane shot, and I had an index card. In my discipline, when 2 forces pull a joint in contrary directions, the joint cannot remain uncommitted. It either holds or it separates along the most established fissure. I drove to my sister's wedding to discover which outcome awaited. One question while the attendees are finding their seats. If claiming the spotlight would cost you the only version of your family that was ever gentle with you, do you still claim it? Answer me sincerely in the comments, because in roughly 10 minutes of this account, that question ceased being academic for me in the presence of 180 witnesses. Here's what I'll convey about my sister's wedding, and I state it without a particle of irony. It was magnificent. The hall was submerged in white lilies. The string quartet was accomplished, and when Brooke descended the grand staircase, my staircase, every baluster of which I had handled like a patient in recovery. Even I momentarily forgot the staircase. She was incandescent, and Grant regarded her the way Abe used to regard pieces deemed unsalvageable that were salvaged nonetheless, and I wept genuine tears into a genuine monogrammed napkin. Because she is my sister, and I am not constructed from shellac. My mother orchestrated the occasion like a maestro, and I'll credit her with this forever. She was superb. Every transition frictionless, every elderly relative guided, every variable managed. Nearly every variable, because throughout the ceremony and into the reception, discreetly with long lenses from the gallery, the made-to-last team was recording the room being alive. And the room, my room, was performing above all our heads. Attendees kept lifting their gazes. You could track it propagating from table to table, the subtle upward migration of chins. Whitfield cousins from 3 states inquiring among themselves, who? And somewhere behind the cake display, there now stood a bare bronze plaque. Because at 4 that afternoon, I'd been informed that a woman from the trust had relocated a potted fern and submitted a written request that it remain in position. Vivian Whitfield lifted her champagne toward me across 40 feet of parquet, a toast the magnitude of a confidence. And I observed the producer register that gesture, trace it back to me, and consult his watch against the remaining light. The meal break my mother had negotiated was 20 minutes away. The segment, I perceived with complete clarity, was not. He approached my table between the toasts and the cake, crouched beside my chair, and maintained his voice at the volume reserved for private confessions. Lights in 10 minutes. 1 segment. The restoration beneath the restored ceiling. The trust had verified to the network that I was present in the room. 1 sentence, Ms. Newell. You can decline and we document the ceiling without you, but I'd be deceiving you if I claimed it would be the same film. I parted my lips and a hand gripped my elbow, warm, manicured, non-negotiable. My mother displaying her hostess smile at the producer. Excuse us. She's required for family photographs. Guiding me through a service entrance into the rear corridor near the kitchen, where the floral arrangements surrender to fire extinguishers and the authentic character of any venue resides. She faced me and the smile dropped like a masking label. Not tonight. Don't create discomfort for us. The familiar sentence, the 3rd occasion in my life it would carry consequence. And this time I decoded everything compressed within it. The newspaper in the shoes, the squeak of the mother's soles, 40 years of lifting this family off the waxed floor. And then my mother, who does not bargain, bargained, which is how I detected that she was frightened. You step into that illumination in your little dress and announce your trade at your sister's wedding, and you transform the entire evening into a statement about yourself. Do that and don't return for Sunday dinners. I'm resolute, Ingrid. I have never been more resolute about anything. There it stood. The full price printed legibly. No concealed charges. The family, such as it existed, against the name, such as I had constructed it. 10 minutes. The kitchen door swung behind a server. Somewhere in the ballroom, 180 people were concluding their salmon beneath my sky. I didn't elevate my volume. Across 9 months of overnight shifts and chemical fumes, I had rehearsed variations of this confrontation in which I was devastating. And standing in the actual corridor, I desired none of them. Mom, the winter you were 15, the newspaper in your shoes. Her complexion went white, then a furious crimson. Who disclosed that? And halted, because there was only one possible source, and he was seating elderly relatives 40 feet away, and some portion of her elected in that moment not to sacrifice him. I comprehend what you've been evading my entire life, I said. I finally do. But Mom, I'm not Grandpa Earl's mop. I'm not the squeak in the corridor. I'm the ceiling. I'm the structure this entire county is seated beneath tonight, gazing upward at. Her grip on my elbow loosened, not in release, in recalculation. And then my mother deployed the final instrument in her collection, the genuine final one. She permitted me to witness the wound. Her eyes filled, and her voice, when it emerged, was not the billing administrator. It was 15 and wearing damp cardboard. Respectability is all I possess, Ingrid. It's all I ever possessed. The corridor hummed. Refrigeration, most likely. I know, I said, and I meant it as gently as anything I've ever voiced. I'm returning it to you, all of it. I'm only claiming my name. I lifted her hand from my elbow, the way I lift a clamp when the adhesive has finally cured. No yank, no theatrics. A quarter rotation and it simply releases, because its function is complete, and the joint is either sound now, or it never will be. I moved toward the service entrance. Behind me, she said, quietly, nearly to herself. You'll come to regret this. And for the first time in my life, it registered less as a malediction than as an inquiry. I pushed through the door into the illumination. The camera was already active. They extinguished the dance floor accents and engaged the ceiling wash, and 180 conversations wound to a halt as an 1897 sky blazed above the reception. Attendees who had been dining beneath it for 2 hours perceived it for the first time. That's what illumination accomplishes. It's the distinction between a room and a revelation. And into that stillness the host inquired softly, "And who are you?" "Ingred Newell," I said. I restored the ceiling. It required 9 months and 129 years. A ripple, laughter, and wonder coexisting for once. He asked what the work fundamentally involved, beneath the chemistry, and I offered him Abe, because the truth is I possess only the single teaching. My instructor used to say, we don't conceal the fractures. We reinforce them until they can bear weight. Everything up there has deteriorated at least once. That isn't the disgraceful component. That's the structurally essential component. I observed that land on faces, on the trust director, on a Whitfield cousin, on my father positioned at the perimeter of the parquet with his hands clasped, weeping without display. The manner in which insurance professionals weep. And then the question I'd been stealing for since the corridor. Your family is here tonight, I'm informed. Who deserves recognition for such talent? The retribution was right there. Prepackaged national. One sentence regarding a mother who answered correspondence in my name. I gazed into the lens and felt the entire arsenal flow through my fingers and released it. My teacher was Abe Fletcher, who restored this hall in 1987. Everything else I owe to this room. Applause originated near the cake and swept through the hall like a weather system. Grant rose first, Vivian second. Then everyone, my sister in white with her hands covering her mouth, the ceiling radiating gold above all of it, and the camera panning across the family table, encountered one chair vacant. its napkin folded with devastating precision. My mother had departed before the lights activated. She missed the cake. She missed her own triumph, which is the essential detail. The wedding of the decade executed to the second, and the final second belonged to the daughter in the modest dress. My father remained. He stood alongside me while the crew wound cables, contributing little, holding 2 champagne flutes as though they were exhibits. And eventually, he touched the sleeve of my sea-green dress and said, "The custodian's granddaughter. Consider you, which I will preserve indefinitely." Brooke located me beside the plaque mascara.